Hello, everybody. In this series of lecture videos, we're going to be looking at the concept of resting membrane potential in neurons. So this is something that's important for establishing the neuron's ability to transmit electrical signals, okay? But before we talk about resting membrane potential, I need to lay the groundwork with some other concepts, starting with this concept here, membrane potential, okay? And in this video, we're going to be answering this question: what is membrane potential? All right, so taking a look at this figure here, what you're looking at is a schematic of a cell in the body. And what I want to point out to you about every cell in the body, not just neurons, but every cell in the body, is the fact that if you look at a cell in the body, it will have a separation of charges across the membrane, right? So if you look here at this figure, for example, you'll see that there is a lot more negative charge on the inside of the cell than there is on the outside of the cell. And that's pretty standard for cells in our bodies. If we look at that charge separation, we can think of that as a sort of form of energy storage. Well, it is a form of energy storage. So if you remember your electrical concepts from previous classes like chemistry, hopefully you know that opposite charges like to attract. Therefore, if you separate those charges from each other, that requires an input of energy, right? They like to be together. It takes work to separate them from each other. So when you see charges separated across a membrane like this, that means that there is energy being stored in that separation of charge, okay? We measure this separation of charge in a quantity that we call membrane potential, okay? Oh, I forgot to say this. Okay, so if we were to allow those charges to come back together, energy would be released, okay? Okay, so this separation of charge is something that we quantify in a value that we call membrane potential. Okay, so membrane potential is measured in millivolts. That's our unit. It is abbreviated like this, MV. Okay. It also goes by some other names like voltage or potential difference. And this is the symbol that we use for membrane potential. It's a capital V with a subscript M. And again, I just want to remind you what we are embodying here is the energy stored in the separation of charge across the membrane. That's what membrane potential is. Okay. Now, as scientists, we can measure membrane potential using electrodes. So if we put one electrode outside of the cell and another inside of the cell, and we hook it up to a machine called a voltmeter, then we get a reading, right? So here we have this reading, -70 millivolts. What does that reading say? What is it telling us? Basically, it's telling us what the potential is inside of the cell relative to the outside. So looking at this example again, we always set the outside of the cell equal to 0 millivolts. We refer to it as 0 millivolts by convention. That's basically our reference voltage, our reference potential. And then whatever reading we get when we use this voltmeter tells us how positive or negative the inside of the cell is relative to that reference of the outside of the cell, okay? So going through these points here, the measured potential is the potential of the inside relative to the outside. The outside is set to 0 by convention. All cells have a resting membrane potential. I already mentioned this before. All cells have a resting membrane potential, but we do have special types of cells in our bodies that can change their membrane potentials in a dynamic way. So neurons are one of those types of cells. Muscle cells can also do that. We have our symbol for membrane potential, which I already mentioned in the previous slide. It's the capital V with the subscript M. All right, so here is a question for you. How would you express this following sentence as an equation? The inside of the cell is 40 millivolts more positive than the outside of the cell. So try to answer that question, hit pause if you're ready. If not, I will give you a hint in a little bit, but I'll pause first. So go ahead and try. Okay, so if you couldn't figure that out, my hint is that I want to remind you the outside of the cell is always 0 millivolts. So if you think about that, then what does that make the inside of the cell? If it's 40 millivolts more positive, how would you express that as an equation? Okay, go ahead and write that down if you can figure that out. All right, that basically wraps up our discussion of resting membrane, not of resting membrane potential, but of membrane potential. These are your learning goals, basically understand the concept of membrane potential, and then we have the vocabulary that I introduced in this section.